In this video, we'll demonstrate how we can dynamically populate the choices in a list editor with data from a SQL database. So in previous videos, we've shown how we can dynamically populate the list that's used in an editor with static data, but in this case we want to use a SQL query. So you can see that we have a list over here which is acting as the data source for our form over here, and that the country field in this form is using a list control as the editor. So you can see that when I click on all of these fields, we're just using a static text, an input control. But when I click on the country field, we have a list control over here, and the list of choices here is based on data from a SQL query. So let's go now and take a look at how this was set up. So we'll go back to design mode right now, and first of all, when we go to controls, we can see that the form itself here is using that the country field in this form is using so there we go, so there's the country field, and it's using editor underbar 3 as its editor, and there's editor underbar 3 which has got a list control in it. So first we'll go over to these server-side events, and in the onDialog initialize event you can see we've got some code here, and what this code is doing is it's opening up the connection to the SQL database and then doing a query to get the list of countries from the customer table. So we've turned on portable SQL, we've executed the SQL select statement over there, and then we get the result set. We dump the result set to string, so now we have a CRLF delimited string of country names, but what we want is actually the data in JSON array format. So we call the helper function JSListToArray, which takes the CRLF delimited list and makes a string that looks like this. So this is basically an array in JSON format. So we get the data in the JSON format that we want, and then we create a JavaScript response to send back to the client when the onInitialize event finishes. And so we put that JavaScript in e.javascript, which is explained in the help text over here. So any JavaScript that you want to send back to the client gets put in e.javascript. And what we're going to do in e.javascript is we're going to create a variable inside the UX object. So we're going to create an object inside the UX object called underbar data cache, where we can put all sorts of cached data that we want to keep around. So we start off, we initialize a cache object, and then inside this cache object we're going to create an entry called countries, and it's going to have the data. So this is going to basically be the country data. So that means that when the component is running, we can basically reference dialog object dot underbar data cache dot countries to get a list of the countries in our data source. So now that we've got this property defined in the onDialog initialize, we need to consume it when the list control when the editor is shown. So now let's go back to controls and go to editor number 3 and look at the set value code over here. So what you can see in the set value code is we're checking to see whether this object exists. It should exist because the onDialog initialize will have run, and if it exists, in other words if it's not undefined, then what we're going to do is we're going to get we're going to reference it. We're going to just create underbar D, which is going to be a reference to this array of countries, and then we're going to create an array in the form that the list control needs to populate. So the list control has a field called data, so therefore we need to create an array of objects where each object in the array has a property called data. So you can see that we're looping over all the items in this array and creating this new array called underbar data. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video. So we're continuing with our discussion on how to create a list editor that is populated with data from a SQL database. So after this loop has finished, we have underbar data, which is an array of data that we can use to populate the list. So next we get a pointer to the list control itself, and then we call the populate method, passing in underbar data, which is the data with which we want to populate the list. Then we basically call the refresh method on the list to make sure that the list is displayed correctly, because when a list is initially hidden and then shown, you generally need to call the refresh method on the list, especially if the list is using columnar layout, which this particular list is. And then we just call the standard set value property on this list to set the value to the current country. So the list itself, it's important to point out that that the list is also set. So if we look at this list, we can see that the data field in the list is just data. So we can see there that the list has a column called data, and that the list is also set to return data. So that's important. This property is important here, because if we hadn't set the return field to data, then this code over here, where we set the value to value over here, would not work correctly. So it's important that the list be set to return the data column in the list. So this is the code path that is going to execute if the data cache countries is found, which will be the case if the initialize event has taken place. But there's also a pattern that you might want to use where you don't put any code in the initialization event, but you make an AJAX callback to get the data. And we'll be recording a video on this technique later. But what you would do is, if this object doesn't exist, then you would put code over here to make an AJAX callback to the server to get the data, and then in the callback complete code you would execute this type of code to actually populate the list. So what we've shown in this video is how you can basically, in the onDialog initialize event, how you can basically go fetch data from the server, from the database server, and put that into memory inside the UX component in a variable in the UX component, and then use that data when you basically instantiate one of the editors. Thanks very much.